On the evening of January 26, 1700, the Pacific Northwest was quiet. The forests of what we now call Washington and Oregon were thick with western red cedar and Sitka spruce, ancient trees that had been growing for centuries along river mouths and tidal marshes. The Heskett people on Vancouver Island had settled into their winter villages along the coast. Families were sleeping. The fire pits were low. The ocean was calm, the tide unremarkable. Nobody was awake to see what was building beneath them. Roughly 70 miles offshore, far below the Pacific Ocean floor, two massive slabs of the Earth's crust had been locked together for generations. The smaller one, the Juan de Fuca Plate, had been pressing eastward, trying to dive beneath the much larger North American plate. But friction held them together. Year after year, decade after decade, the stress accumulated. The edge of the continent was slowly being dragged downward, compressed like a spring, storing an almost incomprehensible amount of energy. And at approximately 9 o'clock that evening, the spring released. The fault ruptured along its entire 600-mile length. The shaking that followed lasted somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. Not seconds. Minutes. The ground convulsed with a violence that scientists now estimate registered between magnitude 8.7 and 9.2 on the moment magnitude scale. To put that in perspective, the earthquake that destroyed much of San Francisco in 1906 was a magnitude 7.9 and lasted about 45 seconds. This was orders of magnitude more energetic, and it went on for 5 times as long. The native peoples who lived through it left oral records that survived for centuries. The shaking was so violent that people could not stand. Some accounts describe a sickness from the motion, a seasickness on dry land that would not stop. The Quileute people told stories of Thunderbird, a powerful spirit battling whale beneath the earth, shaking the ground with their struggle. The Maka described the ocean pulling away from the shore before roaring back in a wall of water. Those were not metaphors. They were descriptions of exactly what happened. When the fault ruptured, the coastline dropped. Entire stretches of land along Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia plunged downward by as much as 6 feet in a matter of seconds. Forests of western red cedar that had been standing well above the tide line were suddenly submerged. Saltwater flooded in through the roots. The trees did not fall over. They simply died where they stood, their trunks bleaching gray in the salt air over the following decades. Hundreds of dead trees, scattered across coastal marshes and river mouths, standing upright like gravestones. Scientists would later call them ghost forests. And then, the tsunami came. The ocean floor had heaved upward when the locked plates released, shoving an enormous volume of seawater outward in every direction. Along the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the wave arrived within minutes. On Vancouver Island, the winter villages of the Pechena Bay people were completely destroyed. There were no survivors in the low-lying settlements, the ones built less than 75 feet above sea level. Further south along the Washington coast, communities were swept away in the darkness. 10 hours later, on the morning of January 27, 1700, a wave arrived on the eastern coast of Japan. It flooded rice paddies, smashed fishing boats, and washed away houses in several coastal villages along the island of Honshu. Japanese officials documented it carefully because tsunamis were familiar events in Japan. They had centuries of records. They knew what tsunamis looked like and what caused them. But this wave was different. It arrived without any earthquake. No tremor, no shaking, nothing to explain where the water came from. Japanese record keepers gave it a name. They called it the Minashigo Tsunami, the Orphan Tsunami, a wave without a parent. And for nearly 300 years, nobody on Earth knew that the drowned forests of the Washington coast and the mysterious wave in Japan were born from the same catastrophic event. That connection would take decades of scientific detective work to uncover, and when it was finally proven, it rewrote the seismic risk map of the entire United States. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. If you say the words earthquake and America in the same sentence, nearly everyone pictures the same thing, the San Andreas Fault. That single fracture in the Earth's crust running roughly 800 miles through California, from the Salton Sea in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north, is probably the most famous geological feature on the continent. It has its own Wikipedia page, its own disaster movies, and its own permanent spot in the public imagination. Hollywood is partly responsible for this. The 1974 blockbuster film Earthquake turned the San Andreas into a household name. The 2015 film literally called San Andreas, starring Dwayne Johnson, imagined a magnitude 9.1 earthquake along the fault that levels Los Angeles and San Francisco. The movie grossed nearly $500 million worldwide. It was ridiculous, scientifically inaccurate in multiple ways, but it cemented the San Andreas as the earthquake fault in the American mind. And the San Andreas is genuinely dangerous. That is not an exaggeration and not something to dismiss. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which killed an estimated 3,000 people and destroyed roughly 80% of the city through shaking and the resulting fires, was a San Andreas event. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which collapsed a section of the Bay Bridge during a live World Series broadcast, was connected to the same fault system. In 1994, The Northridge earthquake killed 57 people and caused $20 billion in damage across Los Angeles. And while that was technically on a different fault, it sits within the broader system of faults that make California one of the most seismically active places in North America. So the San Andreas deserves respect, it deserves attention, it deserves the building codes and the earthquake drills and the public awareness campaigns. But the San Andreas has a ceiling, and almost nobody talks about that. The San Andreas is what geologists call a transform fault, specifically a strike-slip fault. Two tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, are sliding past each other horizontally. Imagine pressing your two palms flat together and then sliding them in opposite directions. When friction locks the plates and the stress overcomes it, they jerk forward and you get an earthquake. The key word is horizontally. The plates are moving side to side, not one diving beneath the other. And this geometry puts a physical limit on the size of the earthquake the fault can produce. According to USGS seismologist Lucy Jones, the San Andreas Fault is not capable of producing a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. The upper limit is somewhere around 8.2, possibly 8.3 under extreme conditions. That 2015 movie that showed a 9.1 on the San Andreas was fiction, not just in the plot, but in the physics. For the truly massive earthquakes, the ones that reshape coastlines and send tsunamis across entire oceans, you need a completely different type of fault. You need a subduction zone. And that is exactly what sits 70 to 100 miles off the coast of Oregon and Washington, buried beneath the Pacific Ocean, almost completely invisible from the surface. The Cascadia Subduction Zone stretches roughly 600 miles, from Northern California all the way to British Columbia and Canada. Along this fault, the Juan de Fuca Plate, a relatively small oceanic plate, is being forced beneath the much larger North American Plate. It is not sliding past it horizontally. It is diving underneath it, pushing downward at an angle, dragging the edge of the continent down with it as it goes. This is the mechanism that produces megathrust earthquakes, and subduction zones hold every single record for the most powerful earthquakes ever measured on Earth. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile was a magnitude 9.5, the largest earthquake ever recorded by seismological instruments. It was a subduction zone event. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, magnitude 9.1, which generated a tsunami that killed more than 230,000 people across 14 countries, was a subduction zone event. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, magnitude 9.0, which caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, killed roughly 16,000 people and generated an estimated $360 billion in damage, was a subduction zone event. The 1964 Great Alaska earthquake, magnitude 9.2, the largest earthquake in American history, was a subduction zone event. Every single one. And Cascadia is the same category of fault. Now, the earthquake magnitude scale is not linear, it is logarithmic. Each whole number increase represents roughly 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 9.0 earthquake does not release slightly more energy than a magnitude 8.0. It releases about 32 times more energy. And compared to a magnitude 7.0, it releases about 1,000 times more. The San Andreas can produce roughly a magnitude 8.2 at maximum. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, in a full margin rupture, is expected to produce between 8.7 and 9.2. That gap between 8.2 and 9.0 represents somewhere between 15 and 30 times more energy. This is not a slightly bigger earthquake, it is a fundamentally different kind of disaster. So why does the San Andreas get all the attention while most Americans have never even heard of Cascadia? The answer comes down to two things: silence and timing. The Cascadia Subduction Zone has not produced a major earthquake since January 1700. That means it has been quiet for the entire history of European settlement in the Pacific Northwest. Lewis and Clark crossed the continent in 1805. Oregon became a state in 1859. Washington followed in 1889. Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Eugene, Olympia, every major city in the region was founded, built, and expanded during a period of total seismic silence along the Cascadia Fault. There is no institutional memory of a Cascadia earthquake. No photographs, no newspaper accounts, no first-hand records from anyone in the Western tradition. The fault has been invisible to American civilization from the very beginning. And even the scientific instruments told a misleading story. For most of the 20th century, geologists looked at the Pacific Northwest and saw something puzzling. Subduction zones around the world, in Japan, in Chile, in Alaska, in Indonesia, produced frequent small earthquakes. The plates would grind and catch and slip and rattle, a constant background hum of seismic activity that reminded everyone these faults were alive and dangerous. Japan alone records thousands of earthquakes per year. Chile averages a significant seismic event roughly every decade. Cascadia produced almost nothing. The seismometers along the Pacific Northwest coast recorded a strangely quiet stretch of crust. Very few small earthquakes, no moderate ones. Practically no activity at all compared to subduction zones elsewhere on the Pacific Ring of Fire. Some scientists interpreted this as good news. Maybe the plates were sliding past each other smoothly without building up significant stress. Maybe the Pacific Northwest had gotten lucky in the tectonic lottery, blessed with a subduction zone that moved gently rather than violently. For decades, that assumption held. Building codes in Oregon and Washington did not account for major subduction zone earthquakes. Emergency planning did not include megathrust scenarios. The Pacific Northwest was thought to be seismically calm. That assumption turned out to be one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in the history of American geology. The silence along the Cascadia Subduction Zone was not evidence of smooth sliding. It was evidence of total locking. The upper portion of the fault, roughly the top 18 miles where the two plates meet, was stuck. Completely stuck. No small earthquakes were happening because the plates were not slipping at all. They were grinding against each other and refusing to move, storing energy with every passing year, compressing like a spring that nobody could see and nobody was measuring. The longer a fault stays locked, the bigger the eventual release, and Cascadia had been locked for a very long time. The man who cracked the case was a USGS geologist named Brian Atwater, and his discovery started in the mud. In 1987, Atwater was investigating tidal marshes along the coast of Washington state. He was not looking for anything specific to subduction zone earthquakes. He was exploring estuaries and river mouths, paddling through shallow water and digging into muddy banks, examining the layers of soil deposited over centuries along the Pacific coastline. He was working in the kind of landscape most people would find unremarkable. Muddy estuaries, knee-deep water, thick vegetation, the kind of fieldwork that involves hip waders, mosquitoes, and notebooks sealed in plastic bags. Nobody was watching. Nobody expected anything significant to come out of it. What he found beneath the surface stopped him cold. Buried under the current marsh was a layer of older marsh soil, dark and organic, the kind of soil that forms in a healthy wetland above the tide line. But this older layer had been abruptly cut off. The surface of it had dropped below sea level and been covered by a thin, clean sheet of sand. Not river sand, not the gradual accumulation of sediment you would expect from normal coastal processes. This was tsunami sand, a rapid, violent deposit of ocean sediment laid down in minutes by a massive wave. And above the sand was another layer of marsh soil. And below the first buried layer was another one. And below that, another. The pattern repeated multiple times, stacked on top of each other like pages in a history book written in dirt. Each buried layer represented the same sequence of events. The land had been sitting above sea level, supporting marshes and forests, functioning normally. And then, suddenly, catastrophically, the land had dropped. Saltwater rushed in. A tsunami deposited sand on top. And then, slowly, over the next few centuries, the land recovered and new marshes grew on top of the devastation until the cycle repeated. Atwater was looking at a record of repeated megathrust earthquakes, not one event. Many events, stretching back thousands of years. And then there were the trees. Standing in the tidal flats along the Copalis River in Pacific County, Washington, Atwater found groves of dead western red cedar and Sitka spruce. Their trunks were gray and stripped bare by centuries of wind and salt. They rose from the muddy ground like skeletons, hundreds of them, rooted in the exact spots where they had grown for decades or centuries before dying all at once. These were the ghost forests. The trees had not been killed by disease, fire, drought, or logging. Their roots had been drowned in salt water when the ground beneath them suddenly dropped below the tide line. The mechanism was clear. During a megathrust earthquake, the overriding continental plate snaps back upward like a released spring, but the coastal margin that had been dragged downward stays down. The land surface dropped several feet in seconds. Forests that were well above sea level are suddenly submerged. The salt water kills the roots. The trees die standing up, their wood preserved by the salt, creating ghost forests that endure for centuries. Atwater had found the smoking gun, but he still needed a precise date. This is where a dendrochronologist named David Yamaguchi entered the story. Yamaguchi specialized in reading the growth rings of trees, each ring representing 1 year of growth, wider rings for good years, narrower for tough ones. He examined the dead cedars in the ghost forests along multiple rivers on the Washington coast, and the outermost growth ring, the last ring the trees ever produced, told a consistent story. Tree after tree, forest after forest. The outermost ring dated to the growing season that ended in the fall of 1699. The bark was still intact on some of the stumps, confirming that no additional rings had grown after that season. The trees had all died during the winter of 1699 to 1700, between the fall of 1699 and the spring of 1700. Something catastrophic had happened during that winter. But without written records from the Pacific Northwest at that time, because no Europeans were keeping records in that region in 1700, Atwater could narrow the window, but could not identify the exact date. The answer was waiting 7,500 kilometers away across the Pacific Ocean. Kenji Satake was a Japanese seismologist who studied historical tsunamis. Japan has some of the most detailed written records of earthquakes and tsunamis on Earth, going back centuries. Samurai administrators, village headmen, merchants, and temple monks all documented seismic events with impressive precision. Satake had been reviewing these records and kept returning to a strange entry from January 1700. Multiple coastal communities along the eastern shore of Honshu, Japan's main island, reported a tsunami that arrived without any warning earthquake. The waves flooded rice paddies and low-lying coastal villages. Fishing boats were damaged. Houses were destroyed. The event was well documented, but it was an anomaly. Nearly every tsunami in Japanese records could be traced to a local or regional earthquake. This one could not. There was no earthquake in Japan that day. No tremor was felt anywhere on the Japanese islands. Japanese historical seismology had a term for this kind of wave. They called it a Minashigo tsunami, an orphan tsunami, a child wave with no parent earthquake. Satake was familiar with Brian Atwater's work. He knew about the ghost forests and the buried tsunami deposits. He knew the trees had died during the winter of 1699 to 1700. And he began running the calculations. A tsunami generated by a magnitude 9.0 earthquake along the Cascadia Subduction Zone would cross the Pacific Ocean at roughly the speed of a commercial jet airplane. At that velocity, the wave would take approximately 9 to 10 hours to travel from the coast of the Pacific Northwest to the coast of Japan. The orphan tsunami had arrived in Japan on the morning of January 27, 1700. Working backward, subtracting the Pacific crossing time, the parent earthquake would have struck at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening on January 26, 1700, local time in the Pacific Northwest. In 1996, Satake and 3 colleagues published their findings in the journal Nature. The paper connected the orphan tsunami of Japan to its parent earthquake in North America, with devastating clarity. The timing matched, the wave heights matched, the travel time matched, the tree ring data matched, every single piece of the puzzle fit together. The orphan had found its parent, and the parent was a monster. Cascadia had produced a full-margin megathrust earthquake on the evening of January 26, 1700. The rupture had torn along the entire 600-mile fault. The earthquake had dropped coastlines, drowned forests, generated a tsunami that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean, and killed an unknown number of people on 2 continents, all while the Western world had no idea it was happening. And that earthquake, scientists quickly realized, was not a one-time event. Once Atwater and his colleagues knew what to look for, the evidence multiplied. Buried soils and tsunami sand deposits along the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia recorded a repeating pattern of megathrust earthquakes going back thousands of years. The geological record now confirms more than 40 earthquakes of magnitude 8.0 or greater along the Cascadia Subduction Zone in the last 10,000 years. 7 of those were massive full-margin ruptures comparable to the 1700 event. The average interval between the very large events is roughly 243 years, although the gap has been as short as a couple of hundred years and as long as several hundred more. Earthquakes do not follow schedules, and the average is just that, an average, not a timer. But the math is uncomfortable no matter how you frame it. 326 years have passed since the last major Cascadia earthquake. By the historical average, the Pacific Northwest is overdue. The University of Washington's M9 project, a major research initiative focused specifically on modeling Cascadia earthquake scenarios, estimates roughly a 37% chance of a magnitude 7.1 or greater earthquake occurring on the Cascadia Zone within the next 50 years. The National Seismic Hazard Model from the USGS puts the odds of a magnitude 8.0 or stronger event at approximately 15% over the same period. For the nightmare scenario, a full margin rupture producing a magnitude 9.0, estimates range from 10 to 22% probability within the next 5 decades. Those probabilities might sound abstract. So consider this comparison. If you were about to board a commercial airplane and the captain came over the intercom and said there was a 15% chance the plane would crash before landing, every single passenger would stand up and walk off that aircraft. Nobody would fly. Roughly 15 million people live in the Cascadia impact zone. They cannot walk off. So what actually happens when this fault finally breaks? Scientists who study subduction zone earthquakes have a modern reference point that keeps them up at night. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku, Japan. The fault mechanics of the Tohoku event are strikingly similar to what geologists expect from a Cascadia rupture. The same type of plate boundary, the same type of locking behavior, the same kind of megathrust release. Tohoku is the closest modern analog to what the Pacific Northwest will eventually face, and Tohoku was catastrophic. The earthquake shook the Japanese coast for roughly 6 minutes. It triggered a tsunami that reached heights of over 130 feet in some coastal inlets. Nearly 16,000 people died. More than 6,000 were injured. Entire towns were wiped from the map. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant suffered 3 reactor meltdowns when the tsunami overwhelmed its backup cooling systems, creating the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. Total economic damage was estimated at approximately $360 billion, making it the most expensive natural disaster in human history at that time. Japan is arguably the most earthquake-prepared nation on Earth. Their building codes are among the strictest in the world. Their tsunami warning systems are the most advanced. Their population drills regularly and knows what to do. And Tohoku still killed 16,000 people and caused damage on a scale that strained the economy of the world's third largest nation. The Pacific Northwest has nothing close to Japan's level of preparedness. Japan has been building for earthquakes for decades. Their skyscrapers are engineered with base isolation systems and massive dampers that absorb seismic energy. Their highways are designed to flex rather than crack. Their population grows up practicing earthquake drills from kindergarten onward. Every convenience store stocks emergency supplies. Every public building posts evacuation routes for earthquakes and tsunamis. Oregon did not update its building codes to account for subduction zone earthquakes until the 1990s, after Atwater's discovery made it clear that Cascadia was an active threat. Washington followed a similar timeline. That means the vast majority of structures in the Pacific Northwest, every building constructed before the mid-1990s, was built without any consideration for the forces a Cascadia earthquake would produce. And the Cascadia rupture, when it comes, is expected to unfold something like this. The shaking will begin offshore and propagate inland across the region. Along the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, the ground will shake violently for 4 to 6 minutes. To fully appreciate what that means, you need some context. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area, the one that collapsed the Cypress Street Viaduct and a section of the Bay Bridge during a live World Series broadcast, lasted 15 seconds. The 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, which killed 57 people and caused $20 billion in damage, lasted about 20 seconds. The 2010 Haiti earthquake, which killed an estimated 100,000 to 316,000 people and reduced much of Port-au-Prince to rubble, lasted approximately 35 seconds. Cascadia will shake for 300 seconds, maybe longer. During those 5 minutes, buildings will sway, crack, and in many cases, collapse. Older structures, particularly unreinforced masonry buildings, the brick buildings that line the downtown cores of Portland and Seattle, will be among the first to fail. Roads will buckle. Bridges will drop their spans. Gas lines will rupture and fires will ignite. Water mains will break. The electrical grid will go dark across wide swaths of the region. Cell towers will fail, cutting communications at exactly the moment people need them most. And while the shaking is still going on, the coastline will begin to change permanently. The edge of the continent, which has been slowly dragged downward by the locked fault for centuries, will snap back upward offshore, but the coastal margin itself will drop. New research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2025 produced some of the most detailed estimates ever of how this coastal subsidence will unfold, and the numbers are sobering. Entire coastal shorelines could sink by as much as 6.5 feet during the earthquake. That drop is permanent. The land does not bounce back. Communities that were safely above sea level before the earthquake will be below sea level after it, permanently flooded by the ocean. The study found that this permanent flooding could affect more than double the number of people, structures, and roads previously estimated. And then the tsunami arrives. You probably picture a tsunami as a single, towering wave that crashes onto the shore like something from a movie. The reality is worse. A tsunami is not one wave. It is a series of waves, a train of massive surges that can continue arriving for hours after the initial event. The first wave is often not the largest. Coastal communities that survive the initial surge may be struck again and again by subsequent waves that can be even taller and carry even more destructive energy. When the locked plates release and the seafloor heaves upward, an enormous volume of seawater is displaced. The resulting wave radiates outward in every direction. For communities on the outer coast of the Pacific Northwest, the first tsunami wave could arrive in as little as 15 minutes after the shaking stops. In some low-lying areas, it could arrive even sooner. The waves could reach 100 feet in height in some coastal inlets. A 3-story building is roughly 30 feet tall. There will be almost no time to evacuate. Residents of coastal communities will have finished enduring 5 minutes of the most violent shaking of their lives. They will be surrounded by damaged buildings and blocked roads and downed power lines. And they will have approximately 10 to 15 minutes to reach high ground before the ocean arrives. FEMA has modeled this scenario extensively, and their projections read like something from a disaster film that would be criticized for being unrealistic. In a full-margin Cascadia rupture, FEMA estimates roughly 14,000 deaths in Oregon and Washington, more than 100,000 injuries. Over 600,000 buildings collapsed or severely damaged, including approximately 100 hospitals and 2,000 schools. More than 1 million people displaced from their homes. The initial economic losses from the earthquake alone have been estimated at over $30 billion, with more comprehensive assessments, factoring in infrastructure damage, supply chain disruption, and long-term economic impact, reaching as high as $134 billion. Kenneth Murphy, the director of FEMA's Region 10 office covering Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska, summarized the agency's planning assumptions in a single sentence that became the most quoted line from Catherine Schultz's Pulitzer Prize. winning 2015 New Yorker article about the Cascadia threat. Murphy said the agency's operating assumption was that everything west of Interstate 5 would be devastated. Interstate 5 is the major north-south highway running through the Pacific Northwest. It passes through Portland, through Seattle, through the major population centers of the region. It sits roughly 50 miles inland from the Pacific coast. Everything between that highway and the ocean, every coastal town, every port, every fishing village, every beach resort, every piece of critical infrastructure built on the coastal plain, sits in the direct path of what scientists describe as the worst natural disaster that will ever hit the continental United States. So what are scientists actually doing about it? And is anyone listening? The good news is that monitoring of the Cascadia Subduction Zone has accelerated dramatically in the past decade. The bad news is that monitoring can tell you what is happening beneath the surface, but it cannot tell you when the fault will break. In 2024, a team of marine geophysicists published the most comprehensive subsurface survey of the Cascadia Fault ever completed. Using advanced seismic imaging techniques, they mapped the buried contact surface between the Juan de Fuca Plate and the North American Plate along the entire 600-mile length of the zone. The resulting images revealed that the fault is not a single uniform surface. It is divided into distinct segments by buried geological features, including large perpendicular faults that run crosswise to the main boundary and subducted seamounts, old underwater mountains that have been pushed beneath the continent and create roughness along the plate interface. In theory, these rough patches could act as barriers. When a rupture begins on one segment of the fault, the roughness at the segment boundary might slow it down or stop it from propagating to the next segment. If true, this would mean the entire 600-mile fault does not necessarily rupture all at once every time. Some earthquakes might be confined to individual segments, producing major but not catastrophic events, maybe magnitude 8.0 to 8.5, destructive but survivable. However, one segment stood out as alarming. The section running from southern Vancouver Island through Washington State to approximately the mouth of the Columbia River showed a remarkably smooth subduction interface. No significant seamounts, no large perpendicular faults, nothing to impede a rupture once it begins. Harold Tobin, a geophysicist at the University of Washington and co-author of the study, noted that this smooth segment could be more likely to rupture along its entire length at once, potentially making it the most dangerous section of the entire Cascadia zone. That segment sits directly beneath the most densely populated stretch of the Cascadia coast: Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia. Portland sits just south of the segment boundary near the Columbia River. In early 2026, the University of Washington published additional research revealing new details about the variability of stress along the Cascadia plate boundary. The study confirmed that the zone is significantly more complex than previously understood, with stress levels varying considerably from one location to another. This complexity creates uncertainty in both directions. It might limit the size of some earthquakes by creating natural stopping points, or it might allow certain ruptures to cascade across segment boundaries in ways that current models cannot fully predict. The USGS Shake Alert Earthquake Early Warning System, which became publicly operational on the West Coast between 2018 and 2021, represents one of the most significant advances in Cascadia preparedness. When sensors detect the initial compressional waves of an earthquake, which travel faster than the more destructive shear waves that cause most of the damage, Shake Alert sends alerts to smartphones and emergency systems in the path of the approaching shaking. For a Cascadia event originating offshore, Shake Alert could provide anywhere from 10 to 90 seconds of warning for communities further inland. That sounds like almost nothing, but even a few seconds is enough to drop under a desk, pull over on a highway, or trigger automatic shutdown of gas valves and industrial equipment. For coastal communities directly above the fault, however, the warning time would be minimal, possibly a few seconds, possibly none at all. Beyond Shake Alert, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network operates a continuous array of seismometers across Washington and Oregon, monitoring for any sign of activity. GPS stations positioned throughout the region track the slow, invisible deformation of the ground surface as the locked plates continue to compress. And researchers are closely studying a phenomenon called episodic tremor and slip, or ETS events. Episodic tremor and slip is something unique to subduction zones, and it is genuinely fascinating. Deep beneath the Pacific Northwest, in the zone below the locked upper portion of the fault, the plates periodically slide past each other in slow-motion earthquakes. These events are not the sudden violent ruptures that cause destruction on the surface. They unfold over days or weeks, producing tremors so subtle that only sensitive instruments can detect them. But they are significant because each slow slip event transfers stress further up the fault, closer to the locked zone where the next major earthquake will eventually originate. These ETS events are happening right now. They occur roughly every 14 months beneath the Pacific Northwest, and the last several have been tracked in extraordinary detail by the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. Scientists can watch the tremor migrate along the fault in real time, moving north or south over a period of weeks as the deep portion of the plate slowly slides and transfers stress upward. Think of it this way. The Cascadia Fault is like a frozen zipper. The deep end is periodically slipping, tugging on the fabric, testing the teeth above. Each slow slip event puts a little more tension on the locked portion of the fault. It is not triggering earthquakes directly, but it is part of the loading process that will eventually end in a rupture. Scientists study these events obsessively because while they cannot predict the earthquake, they may eventually reveal patterns in how the fault behaves in the months or years before a major rupture. Nobody has ever observed a subduction zone fault in the period immediately before a great earthquake. Every great subduction event in modern history came without a recognized precursor. So, in a real sense, Cascadia is a scientific frontier. Everything researchers learn from monitoring this fault in its current locked state is new data. Data that might one day help us recognize when a fault like this is approaching failure. But that day has not arrived yet, and nobody can say which nudge will be the last. The preparedness situation in the Pacific Northwest is a study in contradictions. On one hand, the scientific understanding of the threat has never been better. Researchers know the fault's history, its mechanics, its most dangerous segments, and the approximate probabilities of rupture. On the other hand, the gap between what scientists know and what the region has actually done about it remains enormous. In the Seattle metro area, only about 15 to 20% of homeowners carry earthquake insurance. Most households lack adequate emergency supplies for the kind of prolonged isolation a Cascadia rupture would create. FEMA recommends that residents in the Cascadia impact zone maintain 2 full weeks of food, water, and essential supplies. Not 3 days, not a week, 2 weeks. Because when the bridges are down, the roads are cracked, and the power grid is offline, help will not arrive quickly. Oregon maintains a statewide inventory of unreinforced masonry buildings, the construction type most vulnerable to earthquake shaking. That inventory includes thousands of structures, many of them in downtown Portland. Walk through the Pearl District or Old Town on any given afternoon, and you are surrounded by beautiful brick buildings, 3 and 4 stories tall, converted into restaurants and apartments and boutique shops. They look charming, they are historic, and they were built in an era when nobody thought a magnitude 9.0 earthquake was possible in the Pacific Northwest. In a major seismic event, unreinforced masonry fails catastrophically. The walls do not flex, they crumble, the floors pancake. These are the buildings that kill people in earthquakes, and Portland has more of them than almost any city on the West Coast. Seattle faces its own set of vulnerabilities. Much of the city's downtown core and industrial district sits on reclaimed land that was leveled and built up during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Fill liquefies during extended shaking. It behaves like a liquid rather than a solid, and structures built on top of it can tilt, sink, or collapse as the ground beneath them loses its ability to bear weight. The 2001 Nisqually earthquake, a magnitude 6.8 event centered south of the city, caused damage to hundreds of buildings in Seattle's Pioneer Square neighborhood, which sits on exactly this kind of fill. And Nisqually lasted about 45 seconds. Cascadia will last 5 to 6 minutes. The Interstate 5 bridge connecting Portland, Oregon to Vancouver, Washington, over the Columbia River is expected to fail in a Cascadia earthquake. Both states have committed funding and received federal support to replace it, but construction has not yet started. On the North Peninsula of Portland, roughly 20,000 people live near the critical energy infrastructure hub, a 6-mile stretch along the Willamette River that handles roughly 90% of the region's liquid fuel. In a Cascadia event, that hub is expected to suffer catastrophic damage, and without an adequate evacuation bridge, the people who live closest to it may not have a viable escape route. But progress is happening, and some of it is extraordinary. In September 2025, Oregon Governor Tina Kotek signed an executive order requiring all new state buildings over 10,000 square feet to meet the highest seismic safety standards available. The existing state buildings must be retrofitted or replaced by 2060, creating a 35-year timeline for bringing the state's infrastructure up to Cascadia-ready levels. The Oregon State Capitol building in Salem is already leading by example. Workers dug beneath the 90-year-old structure and installed flexible seismic isolation discs that allow the building to move independently from the shaking ground. When the earthquake comes, the Capitol will sway gently on its base rather than cracking apart. That retrofit carries a price tag of $598 million. And on a flat, sandy peninsula in southwest Washington, the Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe built something remarkable. A standalone tsunami evacuation tower completed in 2022, rising 50 feet above the ground on concrete pilings driven 55 feet into the earth to withstand violent shaking in the soft coastal soil. The 2 platforms can hold more than 400 people, enough for the entire local population. The tribe named it the Auntie Lee Tower, after Lee Shipman, the retired emergency manager who spent years navigating the federal grant process to make it a reality. It is, in a sense, the most honest structure in the Pacific Northwest. No pretense, no secondary function, no architectural ambiguity. A tower built for the sole purpose of getting above the wave that everyone knows is coming, standing on a flat stretch of coastal lowland where there is no natural high ground to run to. It was built by a community whose ancestors already survived one of these events, a community that did not need scientists or government agencies to tell them what the ocean is capable of doing. Because long before Brian Atwater found the ghost forests, long before Kenji Satake solved the mystery of the Orphan tsunami, long before FEMA produced its casualty estimates and the New Yorker published its Pulitzer Prize-winning feature, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast knew the truth. The Kalute told of Thunderbird and Whale. The Maka told of the ocean retreating and then returning with a fury. The Heskayut remembered the destruction of their winter villages. The Hu-Ayat and other nations of Vancouver Island preserved oral histories describing a night when the ground shook so long that people became sick, and the sea came and took everything below the tree line. These stories were passed down for more than 300 years, through generation after generation, in cultures that understood the importance of remembering what the land can do. When Western scientists finally caught up in the 1980s and 1990s, the indigenous oral traditions were not just corroborating evidence. They were, in some cases, the most detailed accounts of what happened. The science has settled on what the Cascadia Subduction Zone is capable of doing. The geological record is unambiguous. This fault has produced dozens of massive earthquakes. It has dropped coastlines into the sea. It has sent tsunamis across the entire Pacific Ocean. It has destroyed civilizations that existed for centuries along the northwest coast. And right now, at this exact moment, the Juan de Fuca plate is still pressing eastward, still diving beneath the North American plate, still locked tight along its upper surface, still building stress, still storing energy, still compressing the spring. The ghost forests along the Washington coast are still standing. The dead cedars along the Capales River rise from the tidal flats, gray and stripped, as bare and unmistakable as they were when Brian Atwater first paddled through them in 1987. They are not scenic curiosities. They are not relics. They are evidence. They are proof of what this fault has done before. And they are a preview, preserved in wood and salt and time, of what it will do again. The only question that no seismologist on Earth can answer is the simplest one: when? If you live in the Pacific Northwest, or if you know someone who does, two things are worth doing today. The first is learning your local tsunami evacuation route, which you can find on your county emergency management website. The second is assembling 2 weeks of food, water, and supplies. Because when the bridges are down and the roads are cracked and the power grid is dark, you will be on your own for a while. The San Andreas gets the headlines, it gets the movies and the news segments and the celebrity earthquakes. But the fault that keeps seismologists awake at night runs quietly along the ocean floor off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, locked tight, building pressure, invisible from the surface, and waiting. If this one landed with you, you should see what we covered in the video right here. It ties directly into what you just learned, and I think it is going to reframe the way you think about the whole picture.